Way back in November of 2019, I had been digging around on Craigslist for a while looking for a suitable big block Chevy for our 1978 Firebird, and instead found this 1993 Generation 5 7.4 liter engine that, well, was kind of a mess. But on November 27th, when I went and purchased the engine, I didn't know that yet. After coming back home, I did a thorough sweep online to find a supercharger to match with it, and boy, did I find one. See, as much as I had always wanted a big block for the car, I always wanted a supercharger more. Which is why we ended up with a Wyand 144 on the small block 350 that's in the car, but that blower is simply too small to mount to a 454. But as fortune would have it, the same day we brought that engine home, I was searching for relatively budget-friendly supercharger options and came across this listing on eBay. It's a 250 supercharger, which is basically the same as the 144 that's currently on the small block installed in the car, just longer. This was an extremely attractive option because it would be the lowest profile supercharger I could put on the engine. I was already fairly familiar with its construction from my time messing with the 144, and of course, being a cheapskate, the price tag was extremely attractive, enough to overlook some of the missing parts in the kit and the pretty rough condition it appeared to be in. I spent a few hours online looking at alternative options, including the Blower Shop 250, which comes with a $3,500 price tag for a complete kit. That's certainly a much nicer and more refined supercharger than this one, but it's also 3.5 times the price, and while anyone can buy one of those kits and slap it on an engine, it takes a real idiot to buy this basket case of parts off of eBay and try to make it work. A week after that impulse purchase, this box arrived on the porch, and I was filled with equal parts excitement and terror about what may be waiting for us inside. The first thing that greets us inside of that wobbly cardboard box is the partially assembled supercharger case. We'll set that aside to do a bit more digging and find some pulleys, the front case cover and snout, a battered intake manifold, a Ziploc bag containing some small parts, and one last little paper ball that contains the gears. With all of that laid out on the floor, it doesn't seem so intimidating. It's a fairly straightforward thing, although we definitely are missing a few bits. And the ones we do have, well, they're not winning any beauty contests. The intake manifold appears to have lived a pretty harsh life and is sporting about 2/3 of a black paint job. A lot of the threads look a bit questionable, and there's cleanup needed pretty much everywhere. Some of these older B&M designs used a large O-ring to seal the blower to the intake manifold, but you can also just get away with using a flat gasket, and that's probably what we'll end up going with. The worst bit of damage is covered up at the rear driver's side corner by a large gob of weld. It definitely worries me that it doesn't appear to have been stop drilled, so that crack may continue to spread in the future. But I am given a bit of confidence by the fact that that black paint is over top of the weld, and it looks like this thing has lived quite a life since being painted. On the side of the manifold, we see the big port where the pop-off plate is supposed to go, if we had one. In the event of an intake backfire, this plate would lift and prevent excessive pressure from being built up in the manifold, which could damage the supercharger. Obviously, we're going to have to buy or fabricate a replacement. As far as the other accessories, we do have the upper and lower pulleys, which appear to be the two that would have come with this kit when it was sold. That very large lower pulley is a 72 tooth, and the smaller upper pulley, which is still bolted to the input shaft coupler, is a 45 tooth. Without the front bearing plate properly installed, it's a little hard to say how well everything rotates and is aligned, but from what we can see, it appears fine. I can't spot any damage to the rotors or clear signs of contact with each other, and the Teflon strips even look like they're in half decent shape. Some more than others, but at least they don't look like they're all torn up or anything. The gear retaining bolts and washers are loosely threaded in, so we'll remove those and just do a quick test fit of the gears to see if we can't turn this thing over. We know this is the passenger side gear because it's the driven one without mounting bolts for the input shaft coupler. We'll get that loosely installed, line up the timing mark with the drive gear, and see if the rotors will turn without smacking into each other. And fortunately, the answer appears to be yes. We can turn the whole thing over with a bit of resistance, but again, nothing is fully or correctly installed, so I wouldn't read too much into that. Purchasing this setup was definitely a big gamble, but seeing these parts working together gives me some hope. There at least doesn't appear to be any obvious or extreme damage to anything on the supercharger itself. The biggest things I was looking for were signs of contact between the rotors and the case, or the rotors and each other, and I couldn't find any meaningful ones. So mechanically, things are starting to look up, but what about that whole front drive assembly? Externally, it looks just like the rest of the thing, though maybe a touch rustier. We will definitely be replacing that seal and bearing, though it's a decent sign that it currently spins freely. Then I flipped the cover over and noticed something that was conveniently left out of the pictures and description of the listing, and that's the fact that the splines have been sheared off the input shaft. After discovering this, I did some research and found at least a few other people mentioning a similar problem with these early models. So it doesn't necessarily indicate that the blower locked up or something to cause this. It may just be a result of the materials used and a lot of force on the input shaft from that huge lower pulley. This didn't seem like the biggest obstacle to overcome because we already had experience changing up the input shaft on the 144, so it felt like it would be an easily solvable problem. However, we're still missing a major component, and that's the entire idler assembly. But again, I kind of felt confident that we could cobble something together that would work, and then we'll only need a carburetor adapter, a drive belt, and a rebuild kit to have a full setup. I was feeling optimistic about getting this to work in just a few weeks, and as the engine hadn't even been taken apart yet, the project as a whole. With both of those, I had no idea exactly how much I had just taken on. Over the next 6 months, we went through a lot to get that engine rebuild finished and it all back together. But you all probably know that, as it's been covered in the last 12 episodes of this series. So you've already seen the process of cleaning up the intake manifold, sandblasting it, and painting it along with the rest of the engine. What you haven't yet seen is the rebuild of the supercharger that happened in parallel. We'll get started on that by taking everything all the way apart. First up on the workbench is the front drive assembly, which consists of the front cover, the input bearing support, aka the snout, and the input shaft. The front cover is held to the bearing support with 6 1/4-inch cap screws that will need to be removed. The impact gun makes short work of those, and we will zip out all 6 in a crisscross pattern. But even with those out, it's clear that the snout will need a little more convincing. We'll set that up nice and precariously on top of some boards and use a socket extension as a punch to gently knock it loose. For now, we'll leave the fill and sight check plugs installed on the front cover. Other than that, it's totally disassembled. Next, we need to extract the input shaft from the front bearing support, and since the splines are damaged anyway, we can just clamp that in the vise. First to come off is the front seal. It's not looking quite its best, but the part number is clearly legible, which is great because we want to keep track of every one of those we can find. We'll use a seal puller to remove it because, well, we're getting pretty fancy around here, but of course a flathead screwdriver would work just fine. The outer ring popped out with just a little bit of persuasion, and then we can remove the rest of the seal as well. Now we've got this flat locking ring holding the bearing in place on the support. We'll use a pair of flathead screwdrivers to get that started, one to lift the edge away from its groove, and one to hold it up to keep it from snapping back into place. Then we'll use a pair of needle nose pliers to gently rotate it and coax it the rest of the way out. Now the only thing holding the bearing in is the press fit to the snout, but it does seem to be holding on pretty well. In this case, there's no need to worry about damaging this bearing as we will be replacing it in the rebuild process. This board with a hole drilled through it should be perfect for getting that started, and a few firm taps do get things moving. Then all it needs is one final push. And we can finally take a good look at our rusty input shaft and its bearing. These two are also press fit together and will need to be hammered loose. Before trying to separate them, we'll use some fine grit sandpaper to clean up some rust that's in the path of the bearing. With that cleaned up a bit, we'll place the assembly in the vise, closing the jaws but not actually clamping down with them. Then we'll let the mallet do the talking. For that last little bit, we'll use a bolt as a punch to get it the rest of the way through. This required switching to the 4-pound hammer as it really did not want to go. Now that it's fully disassembled, let's take a look at exactly how screwed this input shaft is. I had seen a few reports of the keyway on the pulley side being the weak point, but in this case the splines are what couldn't take the load. Or more specifically, the ½ of them that were engaged on the gear coupler. With how long the splines were cut, I really have to wonder why the coupler is so short. It's not impossible that there was some machining limitation that made a short coupler the only practical one for them to manufacture, but what I think is more likely is that they wanted the input shaft to be the weak link in a chain and prevent extreme damage in case a blower rotor got locked up. Since the rotors still spin and don't seem to be damaged, I'm gonna hope that the reason these sheared off was just a long service life. The coupler isn't doing great, but it's much more intact, probably because it's made of a hardened steel. The remains of the gear teeth are still stuck in there, and between that and the rarity of all these parts, I do believe all of them came from the same set, and not that this stuff was just pieced together to sell. But regardless of where all this came from, what happened in the past, or why, we're gonna have to make it work again, and the input shaft and coupler are not going to cut it. This isn't a great sign for our rebuilds since we're only this far in and have already found 2 major components that need to be replaced. We will most definitely be stuck dealing with that later on, but for now we need to continue with disassembly and see if anything else is a major concern. Here we have the driven pulley, which slots onto the front of that input shaft, and we need to separate it from the coupler that it's bolted to. We will carefully clamp that in the vise using cardboard to make sure we don't score up the outer surface of the coupler. The 4 cap screws that hold the assembly together are aesthetically rusted, but the impact gun is able to take them right out. Much like everything else so far, the 2 parts seem a bit stuck together and hesitant to separate, so out comes the mallet again. Pretty soon we have the 2 separated and can take a closer look at each. I think these pulleys were only ever used on the 250 superchargers. They're similar to, but not identical to, the more common 6-bolt ones you see on 671 superchargers and the like, but at least it has 8mm teeth and uses a 2-inch wide belt, so we should be able to get one of those. I believe the coupler is also unique to these models, but luckily this one appears to be in good shape. This is a steel part with a zinc or whatever coating, and it does have some light surface rust, but it should all come off with a fairly quick polish. We will have to find a solution to the input shaft situation, but at least the coupler and pulley don't seem like they'll be a problem. Next up on the disassembly bench is the supercharger itself. There are 10 1/4-inch cap screw bolts that hold the front cover and front bearing plate on, although in this case the front cover has already been removed and they're just kind of loosely installed. We'll zip all of those out and leave the bearing plate sitting on the 2 dowels that hold it in alignment with the case. We'll go ahead and pop out the outer retaining clips for those bearings using a pair of snap ring pliers. These don't really have to come out until later, but I was hoping the effort of removing the rotors from the bearings would loosen up the bearings from the plate. The driver's side clip was being a bit stubborn and required some extra persuasion to get it out of its groove. Next, we're going to need to get the bearing plate off of its alignment dowels, which took some gentle prying from both sides at once, but eventually we were able to make it slide forward. To keep from dragging the rotors along the inner surface of the case, we'll set it on its end and lift that whole front assembly out of there. We'll set the case aside for now and attempt to separate the rotors from their front bearing plate. Even with the whole thing bouncing around on the bench, the rubber mallet was doing a decent job of getting it to move, and eventually the rotor pops free. There are some Sharpie marks on the rear of this rotor, not too sure what those are supposed to mean, but we will definitely be adding our own markings to keep the rotors in order so that they can be reinstalled in the same orientation. That may not be a problem anytime soon though, because the second rotor was proving to be much more difficult to remove. It looks pretty silly, but standing the rotor up on its end and hammering on the bearing plate in circles around it was actually working. Given enough time and enough wax, the rotor did pull through the bearing. We'll set those aside since we're done with them for now and focus on the bearing plate itself. This has two steel-clad lip seals that will need to be removed, and once again the seal puller makes short work of them. Now we can see the back sides of the bearings and these tiny little retaining clips. These prevent the seals from being pushed too far in, and we can remove them with just a pair of flat blade screwdrivers. With those popped out, it's just the bearings that remain, so we'll set the plate up on two boards and use a socket as a punch to knock them loose. They were in there reasonably well, but also weren't too difficult to remove. Just like that, the front bearing plate is fully stripped, so what about the other one? The rear plate uses pressed-in needle bearings, which should be a whole lot of fun to remove, but first we need to separate it from the case. This side also has 10 cap screw bolts that are loosely installed and will need to be removed. With those out, it's just sitting on those alignment dowels, but like the front of the case, it's pretty stuck on them. Unlike the front of the case, there wasn't already a gap to pry from. What eventually worked was setting it on the ground to get a bit more room and using a pry bar in combination with the dead blow to shock it loose just enough that we could get a prying implement into the gap between the two parts. Once we could, well, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, but eventually we got it to move, and even more eventually to fully separate. As much as possible, I was trying to pry against the gasket itself and not the gasket surfaces, so luckily things came out mostly unscathed. That gasket has pretty much dissolved, and there is a fair amount of corrosion around it, so we will try to clean that up as best we can with a razor blade. Since it's possible that the rear plate has never been removed, these may be the original bearings, which are probably due for replacement. One of them is, curiously, already missing its seal, but the other one we will have to pop out. With that out of the way, we're left with the tricky part, getting these bearings unstuck from their bores. It was immediately clear that the seal puller wasn't going to work because the outer ring of that bearing race just fell apart. The steel there is pretty thin and quite brittle, so prying is not going to work. Next up, we'll try using a method which involves using grease to create hydraulic pressure at the backside of a bearing to push it out of its bore. To create this pressure, we need a round dowel or similar object that is a tight fit between the rollers. I didn't want to hammer on the rotors themselves, but this part of the handle from these large vice grips is very close to the same diameter and should work about as well. The idea is to pack the bearing full of grease and then hammer in a dowel so that the grease has nowhere to go and creates pressure which will push out the bearing. It was definitely taking a lot of force to push out the grease, but it just wasn't enough. I even went as far as to wrap some tape around the end of the handle to make it such a tight fit it would barely fit in the bearing at all, and it still wasn't enough. I decided to clean it up and apply as much heat to the aluminum around the bearing as I dared to, but this also made no difference. So we'll clean up all the grease and go back to trying to pry it out. I was able to apply a fair amount of force to the race, but the bearing didn't budge in its bore, and I just ended up breaking more and more of that rim off. So I decided to break all of it off and extract the roller assembly. This came out as one chunk and a bunch of little pieces, but once it was out of there, we could clean it up and try to figure out another strategy. I decided to get out the Dremel. I was trying to get all the way through the steel without eating into the aluminum, and did manage to get it thin enough to damage it with a punch, but boy, it still really did not want to come out of there. I ended up hammering a chisel through from underneath, which did break a chunk off, but unfortunately also managed to scrape up the bore a bit in the process. There was a bit more excavation with needle nose pliers and a punch, and then finally the bearing race rotated a bit in its bore and was able to be worked the rest of the way out. I went back through using the sharp side of one of the chisels to smooth out that damaged area in the bore, and it all seems pretty flat. I don't think it's going to cause any issues. We still have a second bearing to remove, and at the time I didn't really have a better idea for getting it out. This process worked, but I wouldn't really want to repeat it because it's pretty aggressive. Of course, after doing this, I came up with a few other ideas to get a bearing out of there, my favorite of which would be welding a bolt directly to the bearing race. Either way, what's done is done and the bearings have been removed, but the driver's side bore does show an additional anomaly that wasn't caused by me. It looks like the rotor shaft has been pushing back into the case and worn some away. There's not a heck of a lot to be done about this, and it may have already clearanced itself, but just for a bit of extra insurance, we're going to use a carbide bit in the air die grinder to carve it out a little bit more and smooth over any rough edges. Hopefully that gives everything enough clearance so that contact will not be happening again. That'll finish off our general disassembly, and it's about as far apart as we are going to take this supercharger. We may still be in the early stages of this rebuild, but we've already been able to learn a lot about the parts that are there, and those that aren't that need to be.